Welcome back to another Tonic discussion. This week, we're talking about honor. So, what is honor? How do you get it? How do you keep it? It's a uh, seems like a simple topic, but today, with society being so divided, what some people think is honorable, other people feel the exact opposite. So, it's worthy of discussion. What does it mean to us? What are some considerations? I'll start just by saying that to me, it's simply reputation. So, what's your reputation? If it's good, then you have an honorable reputation. If you do something, perform some action, engage in some behavior that lowers your status and reputation, then that's dishonorable. So, what it is to me is very closely aligned, believe it or not, with the Army values. And really, when you look at the Army values, it spells leadership. So, L, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. And that honor piece is just living the Army values. So if you live in accordance with those values, then you have honor. So pretty straightforward. We don't talk so much about the Army values anymore, and I'm not the only one that's noticed this. I was having a conversation with a chaplain who pointed that out, and I said, you know what, you're right. We used to see it everywhere, all the time, and it's just not emphasized as much. Big mystery. In any case, I'll leave my opening thoughts at that and pass it off to whoever else wants to give a stab at what is honor? How do you define it? What are some things that you feel someone must do to be honorable, and some things that once you do them, dishonors you, maybe permanently, or maybe to an extent that you can remedy that and overcome that through spiritual or moral or ethical growth.
I would say one thing with the concept of honor is a bit harder to define, but just speaking generally, something like you mean what you say what you mean. You're a man of your word, kind of. People can rely on you to follow through on your commitments or obligations. And you give honor to others where it's due, that kind of thing. And I guess one thing with just the idea of honor, it seems like that really underlies so much of the social fabric of a healthy society that, if you don't have it, I mean, where we live today, it's like a very low trust society, where people are kind of, what's in it for me? Self-interest is the motivator, and there you got to rely on either a carrot or a stick to get people generally to follow through on things that are needed from them in order for society, to function in a healthy way on even the most basic level. And it seems like that idea of there being this code of honor is something that has been, even though it's necessary for the social fabric, it seems like whatever you want to call it, the regime, the powers that be, the dominant ideology, the influential people in our culture have been deliberately undermining that idea or concept for the past few decades, to the point where now there's almost none of it left in the culture as a whole. So anyway, see John has his hand up. He probably has a lot more insightful things to say about it than me, so I will pass it along.
Oh man, that was good. That was really good. So I think maybe the pithiest summation of honor that I've ever come across is probably from the ancient Persians, who told their sons to ride well, shoot straight, and speak the truth. And obviously that's grounded in their time as a cavalry warrior aristocracy. But it kind of gets to the heart of it, which is a combination of mastery and virtue. And but a key thing to it is it's not private. So honor is not just something that you have inside. It is intrinsically linked to public recognition of those displays of virtuous behavior, and of the mastery of difficult, challenging skills and feats. And so one of the reasons I thought it would be interesting to talk about this today, and our discussion earlier, whose fault it was actually Mark.
No.
Yeah. That's the first, the earliest. How about something like the concept of honor, May 4th?
Really? Okay.
Yep, it was your fault. But what made me warm to it was that Mary Harrington of Cyborg Theocracy fame had a short piece a few days ago talking about the absence of honor in contemporary society, and how this is impacting men. So her thesis is that males have a deep drive to seek honor. We want to be recognized by other men for having, and women obviously, for having done difficult things and having behaved in a heroic fashion. But there are practically no arenas in contemporary society outside of, say, certain aspects of the military, for example, in which that can be pursued. Like, you're certainly not going to come across much honor working in accounts receiving or in academia or journalism, what have you. And this has led to the retreat of men into the one arena in which they can reliably find honor, or at least simulation, which is video games, first-person shooters and role-playing games and things like that, where they increasingly put all of their time. And then she sort of goes on and notes how in a lot of relationships you end up with the woman kind of doing the lion's share of the work, both in terms of providing economically, child rearing, all of that, those kinds of things. So having all of the classic female roles, but also kind of taking on the classical male role of providing for the family. And the man is left with nothing to do but sit on his hands, and then, there's computer games. I can satisfy my deep urge for honor by playing games. And this is obviously not an ideal situation for anyone. It's frustrating for the women and spiritually destructive for the men. So she finishes her piece by saying, this is something that we need to think about as a society. We probably can't turn the clock back in terms of, consigning women to a role as only homemakers and banning them from the workplace, for example. But how do we have a society in which men can seek honor, display honor, be recognized for what they do, and channel that in a way that actually benefits society? So I see Harrison's got his hand up. I'm going to hand it off. But your mic's off.
There we go. Sorry. I'll start with an observation that you guys have already kind of hinted at, and or said explicitly, and that's that you don't even hear the word, honor in everyday conversation. You don't hear it in speeches on the news, in just common discourse at all. So that in itself is kind of that supports, Mary Harrington, her point. It's like, it not only do we not have like honor itself, we don't even even speak the word, so there's no even acknowledgement of its very existence in most of the time. And I think there are kind of two dimensions that, at least that I kind of think of it in terms of kind of like a private and a public. So there's the more, well, there's always a social dimension, but what I mean by private is more of an individual take, like an individual's own, personal honor and the way in which they go about their, the way in which they conduct themselves. And so that would be kind of along the lines Grant was talking about. But then there's also kind of a public conventional system. Like, now this might have just been an accident of terminology, but not totally. But in Rome, you had the course of honors, the course of offices, and offices being honors, honorum, and that was the ladder of offices. You start at the low ranks and you work your way up to being a consul. And so there was this very public and explicit set in stone system of honors and political honors. But you could also think of like in the military, I guess, awards and medals, like for bravery and things like that. Like there are systems and like public acknowledgements of achieving certain levels of what that society perceives as a virtuous course of action or behavior, and it's like a public acknowledgement of that. And I guess that even ties into, I would think, maybe we discussed this on Ali's show, the kind of rites of passage. So there's no real rite of passage anymore for becoming a man or becoming a woman, and it seems like, I think there would need to be so both that promotion of an individual kind of virtuous mode of life that isn't necessarily tied to any structured hierarchical system, but there should probably also be a structured hierarchical system that's kind of universally recognized as, well, at this age in life, if you're following a certain life path, then here are some benchmarks. And we still have politics, for instance. You can still work your way up the political ladder, but it's not really tied to any conception of virtue or honor. It's just that, okay, well, you got your start in local politics, and now you're a governor or a prime minister or something. But yes, so I guess how do you guys think that it should tie into, well, what do you think about the Roman system, or what I'm just calling a public system of like universally acknowledged conventional norms of achieving something? Or do you think that that's kind of too structured, and it should just be kind of the more individualistic take on being honorable in your own life, or both?
I mean, do you mind if I jump in here? Hello?
Go, Mark.
Oh, okay. So it's like interesting because the first thing, apparently this was my topic, I'm not sure, but when we started talking about it, the first thing I thought was, okay, let's isolate what honor is, because as all of you have basically demonstrated, there's a lot of different meanings to that word. There's a whole cluster of synonyms. There's things like duty, loyalty, respect, glory is a big one. And I think also things like allegiance and obedience, and most of all, deference is the thing that I was trying to find, like, what's the through line here? Whether we're talking about the honor of Cicero, or if we're talking about the French version of it, which I think is much more tied up in the noun form of it. It's a thing. It's something that that you safeguard, something that you defend. And again, as many of you were saying, it's very much related to social reputation. You earn a reputation for trust by being honorable is one meaning of the word. But then again, now we live in this postmodern demolition project of language where you have words that are important words and umbrella words like honor that mean a bunch of different things that are actually just, I think, maybe even the intersection of a lot of different things. And then that's been atomized and exploded, so that it could mean basically anything at all. Like this morning, I saw one of those, ubiquitous bumper stickers that read, "Proud parent of such and such high school honor student." I thought to myself, I'm like, look, it's basically a bunch of gibberish that ruins two really important concepts, being pride and honor. It essentially, it's untethered from almost everything else that honor used to mean, even if we're talking about honor as meaning worthy of respect or worthy of social status. And I think that when you divorce that from things like risk or sacrifice, it's like a high school student, at most is going to be sacrificing some time. And they're not even really doing it voluntarily, not in our modern public school system, at least. You'd have to jump up through a whole bunch of hoops, or your parents would, in order to avoid having to do anything at all. And so, so when I think of it, I think of honor. I guess I poked into the etymology a little bit, and it's sort of like, again, it's this bouquet of meanings, but there's two main uses, and I think that like honor can be used as a verb and a noun. They're essentially homonyms, and and I think that those they correspond to two categories of honor, one of which is external, and the other one is integral. And I think that both of them are tied at a deep level to, again, the concept of reputation, sure, but at an even deeper level to the concept of free will. And because of that, both applications as noun and verb have unique dangers. And I also think they have the same one. So like if you thought of the external form, what we're doing is outsourcing parts of our free will in certain matters to an external person or group, meaning of people. We defer to the judgment of someone else that we hold in high esteem for some reason. That would be how it's used in the fifth commandment, for example, honor your mom and dad. That's honor as a verb. That means you're honoring their wishes. That essentially you're deferring. You're a part of your decision-making process to individuals for a particular reason. And it could also mean, of course, honor the wishes of the judge or that king. The system of honor there is dynamic in the sense that the rules depend on what the source authority decides in a given situation, and you have you're honor bound to follow them, and that's the case even if they seem illogical or contradict previous decisions. And I think the big danger there is by outsourcing that part of your will to an external human authority, you can do harmful things that can't be undone, and then just point to honor and say like, well, honor required this of me. Your king points at an innocent man and he says, hey, that guy over there offended me. Go chop his head off. If honoring the king's wishes demands that you do that, if that's the demands of honor, then you become a murderer. And supposedly not through any fault of your own. If you disobey, meanwhile, your reputation is damaged and it's all your fault because the rule was there and you ignored it. And so then again, as everybody's been saying, your reputation is damaged, you lose trust and social value, and maybe even the reputational damage extends to your family and to future heirs. So that's dangerous. But I think that leads into a second form of honor, which is the noun version, what I think a lot of us have been describing, which is where you integrate a static, an unchanging rule set that's so deeply, you integrate it so deeply into your identity, into your being, really, that it's like building an eternal king or deity who can limit your options and basically, not really, but essentially override your will in any given situation because you value that rule set more than even your life. I think that's why we link codes of honor sort of to military or pseudo-military oaths codes like chivalry or codes of the samurai or any sort of other warrior rule set, because what we're really talking about here when we talk about honor is the idea of that which I would die to defend. In other words, dishonor is something that becomes, like death becomes preferable to dishonor in certain situations. Even if that death isn't the result of some external punishment you receive, breaking the rule, which it can be in certain societies. Obviously, it's just sort of like, well, you've dishonored yourself, so fall on your sword, and then you do it. And I think, like in its most extreme form, like though of the integrated form of honor, the inner honor, that's like the sort of honor that killed Alexander Hamilton, and it's also the sort of honor that turned Burr into some form of murderer. So it's dangerous as well, because even on the surface, it seems like it's preferable, but you have to be very careful about what kinds of codes, what kinds of rules you decide to integrate into your being, because you should have a set of principles that you always subscribe to. There should be unchanging things. There should be things that you say, this far and no farther. There should be things that you're willing to die for. And so I think that's, none of that means, I actually think it's very important to have those principles and have a system. And I do think that it's more important to, even though, there can be external authorities that you have trust in, the idea of staking your honor based on somebody else's decision, somebody else's choice is very dangerous. And at the same time, when you integrate a set of rules, a code of honor into your soul, essentially, you got to be very careful about like what kind of a system that is. You better be sure that it's like, that following that is and earning that reputation is not like the ultimate, not the highest, maybe very high in the hierarchy of choice, in the hierarchy of being. But in my opinion, if you're looking at the stack of priority when it comes to how do I make this decision that's before me, you could have a set of rules, and that could be very, very high up in the hierarchy, very high in the stack. But I think that there's another layer on top of that, and that layer is the one that allows you to choose the best rule set, choose the best set of principles, choose the best honor code. And that, that's what we access to figure out whether we've chosen the correct system. But it's also the layer that we access that allows us to break any rule in that system. If you actually break an oath of honor whenever it conflicts with that higher level. And I think a guy with the initials JC had a bit to say about what that final layer of judgment is. And so in that spirit, let me hand it off to our own JC. Have anything to respond to that?
Plenty, but Grant's hand was up first.
Now go for it, John.
All right. First, so you mentioned, proud parents of an honor student. That's at least the student did something. It's better than the proud parents of a gay teen, which I've also seen. It's like, how can you be proud of something that you didn't do anything for? Anyhow, so
You get fucked up the ass. That's something. That's an accomplishment,
Oh,
right? Be proud.
So, a lot of this actually seems to come down to sort of a deontological framework where you're sort of saying, okay, I have these rules that have to be followed, like a specific code of honor, for example, versus a more virtue ethics kind of way of looking at things, where it's something which is harder to define and more intrinsic to your own being, which is still in alignment with something positive external to yourself, but isn't quite so fixed. And if you go back to the Roman system that Harrison mentioned, so they had the cursus honorum, which is a kind of like formalized honor system that they followed to try and ensure that only, or primarily at least, virtuous people would get into office. And they also had the concept of auctoritas, which was this more sort of intangible aura that someone would gain through their deeds, essentially, through having accomplished real things in the world above and beyond merely holding a certain office. So, there was the office that you held, and there was that you actually did while you were in that office, which gave you auctoritas if you did it correctly over time. And so I think a formal system is sort of necessary, because honor as a noun is intrinsically related to external recognition. That's kind of what drives men to be honorable, to seek honor. But at the same time, if it's sort of a purely formalized system, you can figure out how to game any system so that you get the badges and hold the offices and dot all the I's and cross all the T's in this kind of very cynical way, without ever actually living up to the ideals that those were all supposed to represent. So you look at modern American military generals and the fruit salad they wear in their chests. Does anyone really look at Mark Milley or Lloyd Austin or any of these guys and say, oh, these are very honorable men, they are great warriors, look at all of the badges that they have accumulated over their military careers? Like, no, everyone knows it's a put on, right? Or the same with like a sort of banana republic dictator with his sashes and medals and all of these things. Like, he didn't do anything to deserve any of that. It's all just a show. So that's kind of a big danger with a formalized system, is it just becomes a show. But then if you don't have anything like that, then it's difficult to give men something to actually strive for. So you need to maintain a kind of suppleness with it, where you have both the formal system and the informal system. Mark, you also sort of mentioned this whole idea of being willing to die for something. And I think this is actually really important. I think that also gets to this whole question of sincerity versus irony, where our society has become just massively ironic. You're not supposed to take anything seriously. You don't take what you say seriously. You don't take what other people say seriously. Everything is just a joke, and a joke wrapped inside of a joke. Because to be sincere about something is to place some kind of actual value on it. And when you're in a social context where there's liars everywhere, people are constantly trying to manipulate you, it's incredibly dangerous to take anything anyone says too seriously, because they could just be having you on. They could be trying to get something out of you. You become very cynical, and then you lose that ability to be sincere yourself. That's a half-formed thought, but something that just occurred to me. Finally, I wanted to bring up the 47 Ronin, because of course we're going to talk about honor culture. The samurai culture of Japan springs immediately to mind, right? And this is an interesting example of a situation where these samurai were placed in an impossible conundrum, where to maintain their honor, they had to avenge the death of their daimyo, their lord, who had been dishonorably murdered. But then they had also been ordered not to do so by the shogun, and to violate his command would also dishonor them. So, they spent years pretending to be just a bunch of drunks, and on the surface gave up, every bit of honor that they had. And then when the enemy lords guard was completely down. They infiltrated, murdered him, avenged their own murdered daimyo's death, and then all committed seppuku because they had, after all, violated the shogun's command. And by doing that, they sort of successfully solved the unsolvable problem that had been given to them. And that story is really foundational to Japanese culture. It is probably like their primary heroic epic, almost. It has a similar place to like Robin Hood or King Arthur in their civilization, because they solved that problem of honor in such a dramatic way. So I just leave it at that. Those were fairly disconnected thoughts. Grant, what did you want to say?
So I don't think that there can be a formal system anymore. I think we're past that, because society is just too divided. What I think is honorable, so many people might disagree. So I mean, I use it as a construct, and I think what you honed in on, John, in terms of like deontological principles, the alternative is consequentialism. And I reject that. And I don't trust people who are consequentialists, because if they perceive at any point in time that screwing me and mine over is going to result in the best consequences, well, that's what they're going to do. I will never do that. And a part of what honor is to me is having these deontological principles that everyone around me can be sure that I'm never going to violate. And all I can do to prove that is live my life that way and live in accordance with my principles and never violate them. That's the only proof that anybody has. And I want to do that because I want to associate and have and earn the respect of those types of people. I do not care what consequentialists think of me. I care very much what people with deontological principles that are more or less aligned with my own think about me. I'm concerned about their judgment. I'm concerned about being able to associate with them. So you guys, for example, everyone in here is someone that I consider to be honorable. And this is why I'm excited to be a part of this group, is because I want to be associated with honorable people. And, I try and earn that by living in accordance with those principles. And as you noted, John, as soon as you have a system, it's going to be gamed. And it gets gamed in the most perverse way that undermines this fundamental truth. Like, that's really all it is there's principles, everybody's different, but like, how do we circumvent the fact that society at whole has lost its way? And I think this is how you do it. You have your own conception of honor, and you judge those closest to you based on those principles. And the easiest thing to do really is to judge people by their own principles, right? Because everybody doesn't have the same principles as me. But if they have principles that they espouse and they say, I believe this, or they take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and they fail to live up to that oath, they have dishonored themselves. And I do not care what somebody like that thinks about me. And I am absolutely willing to die to fulfill my principles. Most notably, my boss in the COVID vaccine mandate helped really clarify this to me, because he asked, well, I would get asked by multiple people, like, well, what are you going to do if they deny your religious accommodation request? And it's like, court martial, whatever, and it's, well, what if they don't find in your favor? And then it just kind of clicked, and I just, said, sir, they're going to have to kill me. There's no way I'm getting a shot. And he was just like, that's awesome. Because he is of that same mind. You know, he's a man with, you know, the ontological principles that he wouldn't violate. This didn't happen to be one of his principles. This wasn't his quote unquote hill to die on. But I have a tremendous amount of respect for that leader. And I believe that he's an honorable man because he has principles. And I know he has principles and I know that he followed them. So honor is very important to me. I consider it more of a construct than something that exists, you know, but this is like everything in terms of human values. I think it's ultimately subjective because it's derived from our consciousness. And I just, yeah, I have pretty strong opinions on it. And I think that I'm not as concerned about other people's conceptions because I use it. It's very useful to me when I get feedback from people that I consider honorable, that's positive, that makes me prideful. That's how I get pride. And I see it as a privilege to get to interact with such people that I have such high esteem for. And these days, I really don't care that my mere existence is offensive to some people because I know what side of history I'm on and I know who my allies are. Daniel.
Those are good points. And a good example with your the vax, you know, mandate that you took a stand on. You know, there's a couple different threads that have come up that I wanted to just I don't know, respond to or reframe and pose it as a question for further discussion. One was what Mark and then John had talked about, the being willing to die for something like that angle. Is it interesting? I mean, I think it's true that, you know, if you got to have that level of commitment about something. But then that raises the question of like, well, what is it that you're committed to in that way? It seems like that can be a legitimate desire or impulse that gets hijacked by bad actors, you know, like say, for example, in a cult setting, like Jim Jones, you know, People's Temple, like there's this quote from A Catcher in the Rye of all places that, and I don't know if it's Salinger that this was original to him or if he was getting it from somewhere else. I don't recall in the book that he cited anybody else, so I'm assuming it was his, but he said something like the mark of a immature mind is that it wants to, you know, die heroically for a great cause, and the mark of a mature mind is he wants to live humbly for a good one, or something to that effect. And not to denigrate, I mean, obviously you have people that say like Medal of Honor winners, or, you know, I mean, some of those citations, you'd say, wow, this person certainly deserves honor, you know, for dying for, you know, to save the lives of his, you know, people to his right and left, or, you know, or whatever, at great peril to his own life, you know. But then in today's times where we live in a very safe and sheltered society in terms of physical dangers, you know, and so if you have this impulse where I want to have a meaningful cause in my life, you know, that I would be willing to die for, it seems like people, it's similar to like a religious sort of fanaticism, gravitate towards a cause. And if they're not mature in terms of their character development, you know, their emotional maturity, that sort of thing, that they can gravitate towards a cause that is harmful, you know. Anyway, I looked at the left today, and I just consider the ones on the ascendant, you know, who have political and cultural power at this moment in the West, you know, and we're seeing a lot of the negative, harmful aspects of their ideology just being imposed, you know, at great cost, you know, to our society. It seems like a lot of that is driven by that same type of impulse to have a cause that you're willing to, you know, die for, which in itself would be a good thing if it was attached to a good cause. But because it's you have these maybe emotionally immature people with, you know, psychological abnormalities, cluster B type, personality disorders, and that are being told by society. And this is a second point, which maybe I should make later, so this one could get responded to. But people are today's culture. It encourages people to be just affirmed as they are in advance of any, spiritual, psychological, emotional, moral development. And so you have people who are very undeveloped in those ways being pushed towards, here, attach yourself fanatically to this cause, which is bigger than yourself, be willing to go riot or, tear down, destroy society or whatever, right? Like, the woke have been very, or Marxists, as John termed it, have been very good at hijacking that energy and putting it in a very perverted direction, where instead of being an instrument of building up honor and virtue, it's an instrument of tearing everything down and destroying. It's almost like I don't know. So I'll just leave that and could come back to the other point I was going to make later and see if anybody. Mark's, I guess, got his hand up. So Mark, since you're the one that started the talk about having something you're willing to die for, maybe you can talk about that.
Thanks, man. Well, actually, before I get to Grant, I just wanted to agree with Daniel that, well, here's the thing. If you think about people that loot and riot, and there's plenty of them, many that I've seen firsthand, and honor is certainly not the first or the 701st term that springs to mind. What springs to mind is strategy, in the worst way, and some sort of, stochastic, assessment of a situation in the moment, where you say, like, well, my principles are malleable to any moment. What benefits me most in this particular moment of time and space? That is dishonor. That's not even dishonor. That's like anti-honor. It's something that isn't, I would say it's something like evil. Personally, I would say that, like, we're getting very close to the concept of evil when we say that I have no principle that I can't drop in a moment because it benefits me in this moment. But to get to Grant's point, because I think Grant really got to the heart of what I was talking about in terms of the split between the noun and the verb. When he's talking about his conversations that he had regarding the mandates. And Grant, I think, has the right form of integral art, in integrated honor, in the sense that, and I Grant, let me know if you disagree, but I think that, like, the honor code that you've internalized, and it doesn't mean it rules you, but it's the one that, like, it's your guiding light, your rock, essentially, is the idea that you defend and protect the Constitution, or something like what the foundation of that is, at the very least, right? And here,
I'll cut in real quick just to provide clarity on that. It's because I took an oath to the Constitution, not because I'm like, oh, the Constitution is the greatest thing ever. I took an oath, and so I have to fulfill that oath. And I took time to consider, before I took that oath, whether or not I would be able to be consistent with that, given my values. And like, that's where the free will comes in.
right. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I think that it's a difficult thing to define, because there is this intersection between the internal principles and then choosing the external form of that, like in saying what you did voluntarily. You said, okay, I will take an oath to defend these things because they're worth defending. And then you're presented with the impossible paradox, as John was saying, like, sort of with the samurai, with the Bushido code, and how, like, there are ways in which that can get scrambled and, like, have paradoxical problems. And, like, I think your problem was a lot easier in some, not to say that it was easy for you to do, but it was easy to decide which side to go towards, in the sense that, just from a logical standpoint, it's just sort of like, this thing that they're ordering is against the oath that I took. Like, in other words, like, your decision, as difficult as it was at a physical level and in terms of like the risk that you were taking on, whether it was social risk to reputation, risk to your job, risk to, I know many veterans who, they will say that like, well, if I get a dishonorable discharge, like that's going to affect me for the rest of my life. It's going to affect my job opportunities. It's going to affect me on a personal, a deep level. And so it's sort of like even threatening that, even holding that, sort of Damocles over your head was absolutely a threat and something that you needed to stand up to. And like, proving yourself honorable in the face of, in my opinion, a dishonorable virus that was going through every strata of society for the past 3 years, whether it was military, whether it was political, professionals, certainly. Like we all kind of had to deal with that. And we all made decisions that hurt us in various ways. I don't talk about my personal or professional life very much, but I absolutely experienced some of that. And I know John has, and I know from talking to people that others of us have run afoul of that. And so like to your point, I think that like when we talk about virtue and we talk about uh, something, adhering to some set of principles that are, abstract in some way. We didn't, we didn't invent them, but we can see them and define them and to say that and inhabit them. And I think that like, that's a great baseline for honor, right? Particularly now, particularly in like this, I think Daniel touched on this and maybe Harrison, where it's like we live in an age where it's very, very um, chaotic almost, right? Like it's sort of like it's easier to be an orc in this age than it is to be a Westman. It's sort of like to have no honor, to have no principles, to have nothing that you would die for, or that you would risk everything is very difficult because the complexity is so much more. It's like that, even that interaction between like integral system of honor and the external form, which would be something like the Army Code, or a number of other different codes. It's sort of like that becomes that actually like forces us in some way to do what we're doing here, which is to say, yeah, we come from a bunch of different backgrounds. We have a lot of different priors. I'm just talking about the 6 of us or the 7 of us, or um, um, where like there's this idea that oh well, if we conflict in this way or that way, we can't integrate our systems. We can't fully coalesce, like in the sense of what it means to be honorable. But I think that we've proven that's not the case. If nothing else, like we've proven that we could come from very, very different backgrounds with a very wide diversity, let's say, of philosophical priors and like things that we believe and don't believe. And yet there is honor, and maybe that's like the core of it. Maybe the core is that like, I trust this guy. His reputation is solid enough for me because I've seen him go through this fire or that fire. And maybe I wouldn't have gone through those fires. Maybe I would have gone through different fires. But maybe it's just the capacity to say, okay, I know these people will go through fire, whatever it is. And like, in a world like ours, in a world that's sort of on flame, uh, I think that's the most important thing. Whatever our Bushido code is going forward, I think it's going to be based more, it's going to be more fluid than ones in the past. It's going to be based more on like, I can trust, there's a movie, what was the Quentin Tarantino movie? Uh, uh, it was the one, Jackie Brown, right? Like there's a scene in that movie where Samuel L. Jackson's character says, like, I can't trust Melanie, but I can trust Melanie to be Melanie, you know. And I could trust Grant to be Grant. I could trust John to be John, Dan to be Dan, Harrison to be Harrison, and etc. Because like at the end of the day, I know that like when push comes to shove, they will make the decision that is moral and just. That's about it. I'm
John?
sorry. I'm sorry. Who had their hand up first? Was it Harrison or John?
No, John did.
Okay,
Yeah.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, so like the line you finished with kind of reminds me of something that I can't remember where I first heard of it. It was something like, I wouldn't trust him with my woman, but I trust him with my life. So it's this like deontology question, right? It's definitely impossible and really incredibly important to have guiding principles that you're not willing to compromise on. At the same time, a purely deontological way of looking at things can be so inflexible that you become manipulated. Like someone else understands the rules you live by, and then they can, use those rules to make you do what they want you to do. But then too much flexibility, of course, leads to exactly that kind of consequentialism. And my sort of feeling on it is that an organic conscience that's kind of constantly paying attention to what is happening in objective reality around you and to the particulars of those situations is incredibly important to possess. And this is something that has to be trained up over time. It's not something that, and you can't ever really turn it off. The moment you just start sort of saying, I'm just going to follow these rules no matter what, you're not really paying attention so closely. And of course, if you do the consequentialist thing of like, I'm just going to do whatever is going to benefit me the most right now, then that's not consistent with having a conscience. So you might almost say that honorable behavior is sort of doing or trying to do to the best of your ability what is right in any given moment. Both in terms of what's morally correct and, sort of doing things correctly, right? It gets back to that, ride well, shoot straight, and speak the truth.
Is that, John, just for a second, does that mean that we all have the same touchstone? Like, I'm trying to figure out what it is that would be the unifying, I don't know, first principle or law of, say, the bunch of us here, because it's difficult sometimes. What do you think?
It is. I think it's a commitment to what's true, honestly. I think that's like the broader thing that brings the sort of dissident sphere.
Yeah, I agree.
in general
Totally.
together
Sorry.
is sort of like just being like just prioritizing truth above all else. Yeah, what you were saying about rioters as kind of the ultimate consequentialists, or an excellent example of that, I think is pretty on point. Like I think if an honorable person will be willing to die for something, I think that is, I don't think there's any way of getting around that. Like you have to have something that you are so unwilling to compromise on that you will die for that if it comes to it. Not that you'll seek it, but if it comes to it, you will. And there's probably not many things that you would be willing to kill for. Whereas the sort of polar opposite of that is someone who is not willing to die for anything at all, but is maybe much more willing to kill for things. For, for instance, I want your sneakers, I want your TV. I want to have sex with you, even though you don't want to, things like that. So yeah, I was going to say something about my own experiences with the COVID vax, and like I think the clarifying moment I experienced when it became clear that they were going to force this on everyone. And just like Grant said in the chat, that it was an incredibly easy decision to say, no, not doing it, no matter what. If they'll have to kill me. And that was my reaction as well. So, and that sort of put everything into perspective. When you're willing to destroy your career over something, for instance, like you realize that there are higher things than just the momentary advantage or physical comfort or what have you. Harrison, what did you want to say?
Well, whenever we have like a discussion like this on a word, there's always there's always overlap and like bleeding between all these different concepts and all these different words, right? So I'm sure we could probably come up with a solid definition of honor, and we could say, okay, only the things that fit in this box count as honor. But as it is, there is a lot of bleed through to other terms. And one of the terms that I think has been kind of has connections with most of the things that we've discussed is excellence. So I think honor might be, in its various interpretations, like honor as a public and kind of socially consensual system of recognizing excellence, maybe, and then honor as this like integral personal recognition and effort towards developing one's own excellence. But I think I think when you guys were talking about, when Mark asked the question and John, you responded truth, even then, excellence, I think, is and again, excellence, there could be another word for it. That's just the one I'm picking up. There could be some overlap there with truth and excellence too, because it's like, okay, well, if you've got if we have a common goal or a common direction, well, truth could easily be part of excellence. There's like a value to truth, right? And excellence is just the way I see it is the supreme value. And so there's a static element to it in the sense that, okay, well, if you use a physical analogy, you've got the static element of gold having like a high physical value. Gold is an excellent metal, an excellent thing to have. But there's also a time element to it, a dynamic element to it, where excellence is like a goal that you're striving for. It's a future oriented a future oriented thing that either pulls you or that you feel attracted to, and that you guide your actions to find. And so there are connotations of moral excellence and the recognition of excellence, and that kind of that interior conscience, the excellence of a pure conscience, and doing what your conscience guides you to do, even if it's difficult, even if you have to die. And yeah, there was one more thing, but Grant raising his hand made me lose my train of thought. So Grant, why don't you jump in there? Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to do that.
I'll remember it.
Okay, so yeah, with respect to excellence and honor, I mean, I definitely think that they're connected. And my big concern is that if we don't kind of divorce ourselves from, these like a rigid, institutionally derived mechanism for establishing hierarchy, like we all agree the institutions are bankrupt, both morally, intellectually, spiritually. So we have to have our own separate means of restoring and using this concept, because it's an important concept. And a part of being honorable, like we talked about how to define it, like the pursuing of truth, the way that I characterize that, because of maybe inherent negativity bias, is I say don't be delusional. Because that's the real danger, is that you pursue the perception of excellence, or the perception that you are honorable and that you live in accordance with your espoused values, in spite of the fact that it's very obvious to everybody except for you that you don't. And what we see on like a societal scale now, we've all kind of acknowledged this is not a word that gets talked about. And it's because it used to be something based off of community, the environment that we evolved under. Our psychology is all tied up in, having a reputation and trying to elevate reputation. but the rules of the game and the way that it all works is supposed to be in a small enough community that there's consequences for breaking these social rules and doing things that are traditionally understood to be dishonorable, which to me is hypocrisy. That's those. So those are the main two rules: is you have don't be delusional and don't be hypocritical, because being hypocritical is essentially you're socially cheating. You're saying, hey, these are my values, judge me based on these values, and then you're trying to sneakily not live in accordance with those values when it's convenient and can benefit you. So that's how I try and define it. But in terms of achieving excellence in the situation that we find ourselves in, we don't have these small communities. Now your reputation is spread out over the internet, where you can craft a narrative and have a brand. And if you're really, really rich, like Jeff Bezos, you can buy an entire newspaper in order to protect your reputation. Bill Gates does the same thing, where ostensibly as a merchant, you're providing something of value. Like that's a noble profession. It can be honorable. But those two companies, like in the case of like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and what Amazon does in their origins, they're not connected with that purpose. And then because they don't have to be. And then you have this whole ability to shape perception. And that's where everybody's focused on, is how can we shape perception? How can I look like an honorable person? Because now all of a sudden in the current environment, it's possible to do that. It's not something that would have been very easy to get away with in smaller communities. And I think the solution is we can just kind of focus in on it as a concept and call a spade and develop kind of a social technology for filling that gap, and recognizing that it is a gap and it's being exploited, and just recognizing these people that target perception and public relations for what they are. Yeah, Harrison, go ahead.
Well, yeah, that reminded me of the one thing I was gonna say. Ties into what you're saying, because it reminds me of something that Dabrowski wrote, another Polish psychologist, on, because his system was developmental, so higher and lower levels of basically one's personal development, and one of the factors of a highly developed personality he called authentism, like authenticity. So basically not being fake. And one of the examples he gave from that was that, for example, if you are given an honor or a recognition for something that you personally think you didn't deserve, or that someone else deserved, that a person with authenticity, with authentism, would either refuse the award or say, no, this other person deserved it. So there's I thought that was an interesting and an honorable take. So in that sense, it would be honorable for Dabrowski, it might be honorable to refuse a public honor if one felt that one personally didn't deserve it. You don't just take credit for something that you don't think you actually deserved, whereas that's the total opposite of the totally fake hypocrisy that you're observing, Grant, about PR firms. And I mean, I was just watching commercials the other day, and it just, every time I see a commercial, it reminds me how totally fake everything is. That you want to create the image of it. It's just got, it just really rubs me the wrong way how fake everything is. So that you just put up a totally created image of what you want to present, and then that the people that are creating the ads, the people who the ads are created for, the people in these companies, I mean, they don't live up to that image whatsoever. It's a total media creation, and everyone knows it's a total media creation, and it's just very vomit inducing. But I just wanted to bring up that point about authentism. That's the thing I forgot to say. So carry on.
Can I quickly cut in?
Let's let Mark roll, because he's been waiting.
Yeah.
No, that's okay. Actually, I need to think a little bit about what Harrison just said. So let John carry the ball for a minute.
Okay, I was just gonna. So I just actually looked up the etymology of honor, and it's much as Harrison said. Actually goes back to a Latin term of unknown origin. But what's interesting in the entry is that honest has the same root. So the two concepts of honesty and honor are deeply connected to one another, which I think is in alignment with Harrison's remarks about the necessity of authenticity to honor and the total lack of it, just the absolute disingenuousness of so much that that we encounter in our society. Something I forgot to say before, further to what Dan was saying about how you'll have these kinds of prog cause heads who will latch on to some cause as a source of meaning in their lives, probably related in many cases to like that search for honor and recognition. Amazing. I think an excellent example of that is Prince Harry. Here you have a guy who he was all set up to be like a warrior prince out of in the classic mold, right? He was in Afghanistan, he's killing the Taliban, and he's kind of joking about it on TV, and he's a bit dissolute sometimes, but in a kind of a charming way, and like everyone kind of loved him. At least he was my favorite royal for a long time. And then that obviously wasn't really enough, because Afghanistan was what it was. And what happens? He goes woke hard, to the degree that like he has alienated his entire family. He's certainly alienated his entire fan base. The guy has essentially destroyed his life. And you could make the argument that like, well, he sacrificed all of those things for these principles that he decided were really important to him, anti-racism or whatever. And yeah, okay, I guess, but that I think he kind of failed a test of discernment there in terms of attaching himself to something that was actually worthy of that kind of energy, and that destroyed him in the end. Because what he attached himself was not honest, and you cannot find honor through anything dishonest.
Can I ask this though?
Jump in.
Because I've thought about Prince Harry too, and I thought to myself, sort of like he seems to be skipping from one system of dishonesty to the next, in the sense that you call him the warrior prince, and I read some bit of, well, as much as I could stand, of his passages about his experiences in Afghanistan. And I think to myself, it's sort of like I don't want to call him a victim of postmodernism. He's more of a representation and extension of it, of this post-truth reality, where again, everything is strategic, everything is based on stochastic probability.
Yeah. I didn't actually. Sorry, I just to clarify, because those are great points. I didn't mean to imply that like he ever really was that. I think at some level he kind of wanted to be that, at least at one point in his life, but in the context in which he found himself with like public relations and marketing, and it's kind of just this very postmodernist, post-truth way of approaching things, where you can't really be sincere about anything, and it's all just flim-flam. I suspect that probably was incredibly corrosive to his spirit.
Yeah, absolutely, it was corrosive. And it's sort of like, this is it. This is when we talk about what is left that's honorable, I think we're really talking about dishonor, or the things that, like the acid that destroys the possibility for truth, or at least even seeking truth. We're all trying, we're all trying our best. We're not perfect. Accepting that is going to be a big part of, I think, to some degree, repairing the world and rebuilding those kinds of systems, whatever they look like. They're going to look weird. they're not going to look like the older systems. I don't think. I think there's whatever we cobble together of sensibility, of the idea of some sort of intelligible moral order, like whatever it is that like we end up integrating in ourselves, it's going to look different than previous generations. It just will. There's no getting around it. Like we've the level of complexity that, you know, I'm sitting here speaking into a microphone setup that I kind of cobbled together this morning. It's just sort of like we often don't give ourselves enough credit for how much complexity we need to deal with on a daily basis that every other generation, including like ones that are still alive, interestingly enough, like someone who's 90 years old, like let's say Noam Chomsky, for example, who recently was exposed as yet another, you know, compromise target of, well, the globe spanning nightmare squid, whatever you want to call it. Like you look at somebody like him, and it's just sort of like I read works of his, like works of Chomsky about natural language programming, you know, and which delved into sort of, you know, Cartesian theories of automata, and it goes into a lot of different areas. And like, you know, but at the end of the day, like I had the judgment on Chomsky. I was just like, okay, he's my postmodern enemy. I understand this person now. This is not a trustworthy person. And like they continually expose themselves because they have no honor. You know, Chomsky appears on the list of, you know, on Epstein's greatest hit list for the same reason that if Foucault was alive today, he would appear on it. These people are without honor. They pretend that there is no truth. Like the postmodern project, in a way, is a post truth project. There is no bottom to it. You know, it's like Foucault he can rape kids in a cemetery, and like again, this could be a no. This could be a thing that's accepted by a certain group of people and say like, well, you don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. Like that's the opposite of honor. This is where this is where the rubber meets the road. It's just sort of like a thing can be known, and you could say based on that thing that this person has there's no core of iron in them. There's no thing that would say like, okay, you know, I can see beyond this moment, and I can see to some extent like a future that I don't I'm not involved in because I'm not alive. Like to some degree honor is a long-term investment, is the thing that I'm going to say. It's sort of like, and that long term is, you know, eternity to some degree. You know, it's like we to do a thing in the moment, to make a decision in the moment, when it's a snap decision. It's sort of like if we're going to look at honor as a system, then the system should say, in the future, even after I'm dead, everything that I've done will measure up to the kind of a future that people would want to live in.
Daniel.
I'm sorry, Daniel. Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, what you're saying about Foucault and Chomsky and people like that, it kind of brings to mind a comparison of a moral philosopher in 323 BC versus a moral philosopher in 2023 AD. You know, like how I guess with ancient philosophers is like they did philosophy. It was like a way of life, how to live well. There's this idea supposed to be reflected in a lifestyle more than theory. Whereas today, you know, you can have a moral philosopher. It's like could give you a whole dissertation on, you know, some moral position, but it may or may not have any morality that they live by, really. You know, it's just, it completely is divorced from any kind of practice, any kind of, you know, and I guess it's
right. No, I agree. Yeah, no, just to cut in, like I agree. Like it's sort of there's no like they could even adopt something like that is similar or sounds similar to what we're talking about just for a moment, just for 5 minutes, as long as it, you know, as long as it
furthers
benefits
their aim.
them in that moment. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it's kind of like it comes down to the lack of any kind of unifying vision or moral philosophy or cultural story, whatever, that is probably easier in a more, because the word has different connotations. I hate to use it, but I think it's correct. A more primitive culture has, an easier time having some kind of story they can tell themselves about. This is who we are. This is what we're about. This is what we value. This is what the ideal human life looks like. So there's an easier time of forming, moral judgments or some sort of character in line with that. Whereas in today's world, everything's been deconstructed so much that there's no unifying vision for what a good life should even be. And so you have these, and I have been thinking about this. Like, I don't know whether it's possible, is it with your moral philosophy? It's either got to be grounded in something else, or it's just kind of self-referential in a circular way, or arbitrary posited, or it's self-evident, if that's possible. Maybe it is. I think an argument could be made that it is, but you have. I wish Luke was here because he's more the expert in this. I mean, just the highlights of moral philosophy, of like virtue ethics with Aristotle and others, that a good character precedes right action. That in order to do right things, you develop a good character. And then the deontological, Kant being an example of this, like have these right rules of thumb or whatever that reliably give you the right action in a circumstance, and that's what's to be emphasized. And there's something to be said for that, because to develop good character, you got to practice right action, I suppose. Or there's which I kind of prefer better, a blend of this is like something like Aquinas's natural law theory, but based on of human nature, like a natural law moral philosophy based on a human nature, where with human nature it would be what is, and here I'm question begging, I know, but it's what is strong, what gives a person strength and excellence and a good life, like that kind of thing, like in us, I guess, looking at how people live and how people live in ways that are healthy in the sense that you talk about integrity, like a structural integrity, like that, where the whole thing coheres and it's flourishing and it's optimized for people to live well. For example, people to raise children and have good relationships, parents with children, spouses, happy, healthy, flourishing marriages, and flourishing, families, and flourishing, neighborhoods and civic groups, people to the needs that people have for fellowship, belonging, camaraderie, physical health, and emotional well-being, all that to be realized, and to say then that informs the virtue ethics or the right action, which I guess are two sides of the same coin. But what we have today is like you have feminist care ethics, which and you also have the consequentialism, the utilitarianism, and both of those, to me, they're useful in so far as they can act as checks on a moral system, not as the foundation of the moral system. What I mean by that, like say care ethics, and this was the idea that as a feminist alternative to male dominated moral philosophy, where it's like it's all about the relationship of mother to child, and that sort of caring, that's supposed to be the basis for a feminist morality. But what we have is like the longhouse, like John's article about the safetyism. The only legitimate use of a care ethics to me is to have as a check on, if you can take a deontological rule-based ethics to such an extreme that you're following the rule for its own sake, even though it's harming everybody involved in the exchange. So you could have whether consequentialism or feminist care ethics is like just the corrective to that, to say, okay, let's keep in mind that we're about helping real life flesh and blood people, and not promoting some set of rules for its own sake, or some theory for its own sake, grounding it in something real. But at the end of the day, I probably have done a poor job of articulating this, but a moral philosophy that is based on real life human nature, how to promote more of the things that in a natural state people value, people want, which is like families, relationships, strength, virtue, integrity, people, competence, that type of stuff, which be beyond me to then list what that would look like. But just saying that should be the orientation, and that's really what's lacking in our culture, is any kind of vision like that of what people, what the ideal is for people to flourish individually, and as part of families, and as part of communities and so forth. How do people live well? And there's no unifying vision there. So I don't know if we have to do like a Platonic thing where we invent a set of noble lies which I don't think that's the right answer. Some kind of religious story that we just invent and pretend like it's real, and after a couple of generations people accept it. I don't think that's the answer, but I don't know what the answer is. Like, how do you, and maybe it's not possible in a nation or world that's as global and so many, on the scale that things are, where so many relationships are impersonal, you have these large institutions. How do you maybe it's not possible to present a unifying vision that people will buy into. Maybe the answer is just, after this whole project collapses and the next go around, when people are rebuilding society, people cohere around a vision, and whichever society has the best vision will outcompete the others. I don't know, but anyway, that's my mishmash of ideas. So on to Grant.
Yeah, I think that it's really hard, right? It's really hard to define all those things. And so what we have today is a bunch of people who've given up trying and gone the postmodernist route, and they try and say that truth doesn't exist, and then anybody who tries to say that it does has nefarious intentions, as if they don't. And then on top of all that, they'll go so far as to say that character just isn't a thing, because that goes along with it. Like, nobody has good character, and I've experienced this personally with people that have are of what I consider to be low character, and they just outright deny that anyone has better character than them. Oh, everybody's a liar. Everybody's just out for themselves. I'm just playing the game, right? And those people are lost, because that's not true. That's not the nature of reality. There are human beings that are capable of great honor and making the world a better place and serving those around them, while also taking care of themselves. The idea that you can't live a fulfilling, successful life going after your purpose without screwing people over in the process, that's kind of like the inherent way that nature works, is just a consequence of economic ignorance. That's obviously, the world has more material wealth and abundance than there was 10,000 years ago. And if we can figure out the social technology of how to not have, that spin into materialism, and how have people who essentially it's a bunch of people engaging in efficient self-deception, trying to promote this lie because it makes it easier for them to extract more wealth and prosper. I view that it's very simple to me. There's a legitimate way to prosper, and that is through service to others. You don't take it out of somebody else's hide. You produce value by becoming excellent, developing skills, and then you get a share of that value that you produce in order to get by. I mean, that's in accordance with the constraints imposed on us by nature, and I just, it's disgusting to hear somebody say that, there's no such thing as character and everybody's a liar. It's like, then what are you doing here? Like, how can you even internalize such a belief and continue going on living when
That's
you're
a shibboleth
openly
for me.
acknowledging that you are doing it at the expense of everybody around you? Like, the more you succeed, the more you are stealing and tearing down others. It's alien to me. It's patently false. And yeah, exactly how to be virtuous, exactly the stuff to do, and building a robust system. I don't know that we need that. I mean, we just need a fundamental acknowledgement that there's something there, that you can pursue excellence. We don't necessarily need to know the best way to do it or how to do it, just that you can, and that it's worth trying to, and that honor is a thing that exists, and having it is better than not. John.
That was great. I'm going to propose that we do concluding remarks. How does everyone feel about that? Yes? Cool. So
Sounds
these
good.
will be mine. These will be mine. Brothers will fight and kill each other. Sisters, children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world, whoredom rife. An axe age, a sword age, shields are riven, a wind age, a wolf age. Before the world goes headlong, no man will have mercy on another. That is a description of Ragnarok, the winter of the world. You find similar descriptions of what the Kali Yuga looks like in the Indian tradition. And, this sort of makes me feel that these sorts of times have come before. And, we can certainly look at history. We can see the decadent periods and all sorts of civilizations when honor and all conception of honor, all belief in anything good in the world, in virtue, in honesty, just leaches out of society. And everything kind of falls apart, not just socially, but at a psychological or emotional level that destroys people as well. So the Mary Harrington article that kind of partially inspired this episode, it's actually titled "The Incredible Shrinking Men." Just Incredible Shrinking Men. And I think that title on its own gets at something important here, is that when you're deprived of honor, internally, the practice of it, the external recognition of it, you are diminished. As Harrison said, this is tightly wound up with this notion of excellence, of pushing for something higher and better, of growing, of virility and vitality and mastery. You take all that away, and you get your opposites. You get decay, and you shrink, right? I think there is a hunger out there among some people who haven't fully succumbed to this. And I think even amongst I think a lot of the kind of low character people who say, oh, there's no such thing as honesty, everyone's out for themselves and so on. I think a lot of cases, they're probably wounded idealists. They'd like to believe, they'd like to practice it, but they haven't experienced it. And it's just easier to take the path of least resistance. They could probably be improved if the social standards improved, they would hold themselves to them. But it falls on, you know, those of us who haven't succumbed in that fashion to point the way towards and start building something better. Mark mentioned, you know, the honor code, the kind of new Bushido that we're going to have to develop. And I think that is absolutely going to be something very important in the coming years. You know, we have this problem of an elite, so-called, which is not elite in any way, except that they have power and wealth, but they are awful in everything. They lie, they cheat, they steal. They are hypocrites in every possible respect. You know, they engage in perversions of the most monstrous sort and encourage others in those. This is intolerable. It can't go on, so it won't. We're going to need a new elite. Where will that elite be found? Well, that remains to be seen, although I have some ideas on that. But that elite will have to be virtuous if anything is really going to change for the better in the next historical cycle. And that is going to mean some kind of honor code. I'll leave it there.
Anybody want to go next? Okay, I'll go next. I'm sorry for interrupting Grant and his magnificent tract there, because he said something that really stuck out to me, which is that we see this, actually see people and hear them, and sometimes they're even in our own lives, and it's an insane thing to experience. To hear someone that, you know, you grew up with and know and ostensibly trust and love, and then to hear them say these things, to hear them say, well, there is no truth. Everybody's really out for themselves, ultimately, underneath everything. And you hope, like I do. I had an experience of this sort in the past couple of months, where there was someone I've known for almost my entire life, and they were saying these, and like I could not wrap my head around it. Well, I could, obviously, because I've seen it permeated throughout culture and in some ways throughout the world. But it's just sort of like it hits home when it's somebody that you said, like, well, I've known you. In this case, it was a woman that I've known from when I was a very young man, essentially a child. And to see people like say it is creepy, because it amounts to people that are, you know, you hate to say lost. I hate to say lost, at least. You know, I am believe it or not, I'm an optimist. I believe the cat can be found, but it's difficult. There's a very, very thick shaft that's happening right now. A very thick fog. And to John's point, yeah, there needs to be a code that's developed, but it's not going to be like older codes. I don't think it can. Like, I think that, you know, to say like, okay, well, we're going to commit ourselves to the truth. Well, that's going to be similar to what some bad people will say. They'll say, we also commit to a code, and it's also about the truth. And by the way, here's our committee of truth. Here's our ministry of truth. If you doubt us, just go to Snopes.com or something, and like, we'll prove to you what is true. You know, we'll come up with a system that allows you to test yourself against it. And weirdly enough, like, all of those truths will support the idea of you just doing whatever the hell you were going to do anyway. And again, we can't have that. We can't have chaos. You know, we need to, even though I started this by saying that, like, you know, by criticizing to some degree the idea of an honor code, the fact of the matter is that we do need an honor code. And that honor code is going to be based on something like what Grant was saying, where it's just sort of like, yeah, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I disagree with A, C, and F, but I can tell somehow that you're looking for the truth, and that you're telling me the truth. You're telling me you're telling me the truth as far as you can grasp it, and it's sort of like, and that's what I think everyone is doing. Well, not everyone, but like everyone in our circles is trying to say, like, okay, I'm trying to grasp because this is a dangerous situation, because we have like a lot of orcs and goblins running around that are just saying, hey, there is no truth, and by the way, gimme, and in John, since John provided a quote, I found one from Tolkien, from his letters, which I think in part sums up the problem. And so he says, in The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not basically about freedom, though that is naturally involved. It's about God and his sole right to divine honor. The Elder and the Numenorians believed in the one, the true God, and held worship of any other person as an abomination. Sauron desired to be God King and was held to be this by his servants. If he had been victorious, he would have demanded divine honor from all rational creatures and absolute temporal power over the whole world. And so there I say, like, okay, so honor is something like, yes, I don't know if it's generated from within or if it's something it's something that you adopt and integrate. But there are different hierarchies to it. And so as you go up far enough, you say, like, well, I have honor within myself and I have this code within myself and I will follow it, and I will follow it to the truth. I think outside of that, it does get more dangerous, because every time you export it to a different authority structure, you have to realize that that authority structure also exports or outsources their authority to another level higher. And that ultimately, you probably are going to find yourself either on the side of truth or untruth. And hopefully the system of honor that we develop will be on the side of truth. And that's it.
All right, I'll end with a quote too. We'll be doing at least a couple shows on the Forest Passage by Ernst Jünger on mind matters, and so with it fresh in my mind, I wanted to read something from near the end of the book. So he writes, "Whatever the situation, whoever the other, the individual can become this fellow human being, and thereby reveal his native nobility. The origins of aristocracy lay in giving protection from the threat of monsters and demons. This is the hallmark of nobility, and it shines today in the guard who secretly slips a piece of bread to a prisoner. This cannot be lost, and on this the whole world subsists. These are the sacrifices on which it rests." So a whole lot of context missing, but I thought there were at least a few things in there that touched on our discussion. And that's it for me.
I guess the thing to do is to end with a quote, so I'll follow suit. I was actually thinking about this quote from G.K. Chesterton and The Everlasting Man, and my own experience with theism. I've been most convinced of it when I guess by it, not so much seeing goodness, but seeing the evil in the world and thinking, like, wow, if there's people and forces this depraved acting on us, and if there seems to be this fatal flaw built in, then maybe there is some, opposite, I guess, the symmetry, but maybe there's some opposite, form of goodness that would counteract this. But there's this line from Everlasting Man. Now, whether this is historically accurate, I don't know. But the sentiment, it seems to map onto what we're experiencing today. Right. So anyway, he says, all the great groups that stood about the cross represent in one way or another the great historical truth of the time, that the world could not save itself. Man could do no more. Rome and Jerusalem and Athens and everything else were going down like a sea turned into a slow cataract. Externally, indeed, the ancient world was still at its strongest. It is almost always at that moment that the inmost weakness begins. But in order to understand that weakness, we must repeat what has been said more than once. That it was not the weakness of a thing originally weak. It was emphatically the strength of the world that was turned to weakness and the wisdom of the world that was turned to folly. In the story of Good Friday, it is the best thing in the world that are at their worst. That is what really shows us the world at its worst. It was, for instance, the priests of true monotheism and the soldiers of an international civilization. Rome, the legend founded upon fallen Troy and triumphant over fallen Carthage, has stood for a heroism which was the nearest that any pagan ever came to chivalry. Rome had defended the household gods and the human decencies against the ogres of Africa and the hermaphrodite monstrosities of Greece. But in the lightning flash of this incident, we see great Rome, the imperial republic, going downward under her Lucretian doom. Skepticism had eaten away even the confident sanity of the conquerors of the world. He who is enthroned to say what is justice can only ask, what is truth? So in that drama which decided the whole fate of antiquity, one of the central figures is fixed in what seems the reverse of his true role. Rome was almost another name for responsibility, yet he stands forever as a sort of rocking statue of the irresponsible. Man could do no more. Even the practical had become the impractical. Standing between the pillars of his own judgment seat, a Roman had washed his hands of the world. Talking about the Pilate's line, what is truth, and all that. But it does seem like there's this in our time. I guess I'm kind of pessimistic. If there's not something or someone or some force of good outside of, maybe that could operate both immanently and transcendently, so could operate in and through people. But if there's not something greater to bring that virtue or orient people towards virtue, I don't really see. I'm very pessimistic. I wish I wasn't. I wish there was a way that I could see looking forward that things will work out in our culture. I just see, given looking at America, I see a real tragic, kind of along the lines of a tragic hero where it did some great things, could have been great. It could have been so much more, but there's this fatal flaw that's kind of baked into it that undermines the whole thing. And now we're seeing that play out, like the downfall of this, I guess, iconic, tragic hero that, it could have been better, but given the type of, like, there's this fatal flaw, whether it's human nature or whether it's, I'm not sure, the undermining of some sort of parasitic evil that has worked its way into the whole thing, but there just seems like humans have done the best they can. And so, I would like to believe, I would like it to be true that there is a God of some sort, that's indicated by these stories and symbols and hopes and dreams and prayers and all that, that will intervene in some way, whether through people or whether transcendently or whatever. But yeah, it's kind of my closing thought, which too bad Doc's not here, because I'm sure it would piss him off royally for me to end on a theological note. But anyway.
Well, I'll close this out since everybody's doing quotes, and you're talking pessimism, Daniel. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Tonic Discussions on Honor. If you enjoyed the conversation, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and we hope to see you all next time.